So real quick, show of hands, who here has used Unity's navigation system before Unity 5.6? Just sometime ever. Fantastic. Who here has used Unity's navigation features in 5.6? Oh, a surprisingly good number. Fantastic. That's great. So we're going to talk about these new features, and we're going to talk about the use cases and what they really can do for us. And I want to want you to keep in mind sort of the processes, the things you couldn't do before, or the things about navigation that might be pain points or just not really possible. And we're going to talk about how these new features are going to make it possible and actually very, very simple to do. All right? So we're going to talk about these new navigation features in Unity, and these were released in Unity 5.6. Now, Unity 5.6 brought two big changes to how navigation worked. Okay? So the first is there's this low-level internal API. And what that means is we can get really granular, really interesting control over the navigation and navigation build systems through code using the API. All right? There's a lot of really weird and cool stuff we can do with that, but also, more than likely, most of you will never, ever look at that ever. All right? Just, it's, some of you might, most of you won't. So the other change that's really interesting is the high-level components. These are the ones that you'll use in the engine, very much like you did with the old nav system. All right? These are your interface to that low-level API. They do all of the really hard work for you so that you can just focus on building your games, right? And we're going to focus on talking about this high-level API component system and how we can use it in various use cases. So these high-level components consist of 4 real components we're going to talk about here real quick. So we've got the Nav Mesh surface. So the Nav Mesh surface is going to contain the actual Nav Mesh. Nav Meshes are no longer going to be scene wide. They're no longer going to be statically baked in one location. They're going to be a component, and we're going to be able to do a lot of really neat stuff because they're a component. All right? We're also going to talk about these Nav Mesh links, which replace the off-mesh links that we've seen before. And again, you're going to see very big improvements to how they function. All right? We all remember the off-mesh links and kind of how limited they could potentially be, and we're going to see how the Nav Mesh links really open the door to some wild ideas. All right? We also have the Nav Mesh modifier and the Nav Mesh modifier volume. We're not going to look at those so much today, but really, those are just cubes, volumes that we can use to modify how the Nav Mesh works. You can think of like the Nav Mesh obstacles that you used previously, which still work actually, and the Nav Mesh modifiers just modify pieces of a Nav Mesh to be, have different properties or whatever. So not just obstacles, but maybe just zones that make the Nav Mesh faster or slower or whatever, right? And so I don't want to just stand here and talk with PowerPoint. I actually don't like PowerPoint. So I just want to get through that, and we're going to actually see these in Engine, and we're going to talk about some of these features. So let's leave PowerPoint here, and you can see what I see. Fantastic. So I have a scene right here, and I'm going to kind of just come a little closer here. And so this is just a standard sort of use case scene, and I have my navigation sort of traditional window here, and I could open up the navigation window and then bake here like I used to, but I'm not going to do that anymore. This is kind of, I'm not deprecated, still works. You could still absolutely do this, but there's a much better way now. And if you want to learn more about it, you can actually just click the button that is here now to learn more about it. So instead, what I'm going to do is I have this game object called my Nav Mesh Builder. It's just this game object here. There's a script on it. This script has nothing to do with navigation. It just makes one player run and another player chase. That's it. There's nothing really special about this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click Add Component. I'm going to go to Navigation, and I'm going to add a Nav Mesh Surface component directly to this game object, right? So this may look familiar. This is like our traditional Nav Mesh baking window, and I'm just going to click Bake. And there we go, we have our Nav Mesh baked. Okay, pretty simple. And so I'm going to press play, and we're going to see our first kind of issue. All right? So the player's going to run from the shark is going to catch the player's head's going to fall into a bucket of spices. We've all been there. And we want to avoid that situation, right? So the first problem really is that this Nav Mesh is a one-size-fits-all. So the player should not, or the character can move through this, but the shark should not be able to move through there. The shark's bigger. Shark should not be able to do that. So the problem is that there's no real limiting how big or small or whatever can fit through what. If it has a nav mesh, the nav mesh just sort of works, right? And we can kind of make it work through obstacle avoidance and stuff, but it's tricky. It's harder than it needs to be. So here's what I'm going to do. All right, so again, using the navigation window of old, we've added an agents tab, and we can declare different agents. So I have my standard humanoid, and then I created a shark, which is just a little bit bigger, right? Shark guy's bigger. And so on this Nav Mesh Builder game object, I'm going to add another Nav Mesh surface. So add component, navigation, Nav Mesh surface. Now this one, I'm going to say, is a shark's nav mesh. And then I'm going to bake it. And what we have here now is 2 nav meshes. We can have 2, 3, 10, 20. We can have as many nav meshes as we want. They can overlay, they can be separate, whatever. It's a component-based workflow. All right, so I have 2 nav meshes now. And if I were to run this right now, the shark would still catch the player, because I need to just click on my shark, go to the nav mesh agent, and say, you know what? You're a shark now. Congratulations. All right. And so now when I press play, the character will move between the barrels, score, and I synced up some confetti. And I spent most of my time working on the confetti. So if anything else looks not great, it's because I spent all of my time on the confetti, which I think was time well spent. Now, because I have these scene-based, component-based nav meshes, right? The nav mesh is a component. It's baked. It's part of a game object, right? That's really, really powerful. It's what enables us to do a lot of the really cool stuff we're going to look at. One of the coolest things, and one of the biggest use cases, is what if I want to run on the walls? Why does my nav mesh have to be the floor, right? Why can't I align it however I want to align it? Well, I'm going to go down here to my prefabs folder, and I'm going to find this Demo 1 extension prefab. It's just a piece of ground. I'm going to drag it into my hierarchy, and you'll see that it has its own nav mesh. That nav mesh was part of the prefab. I didn't bake that just now, all right? So we have prefab-based nav meshes. So we can pre-bake all our stuff, store it in that, or pre-bake our stuff, store it in these prefabs, and there we go. One of the other interesting things about this nav mesh is it's using this Nav Mesh Link right here. So if I look at the Demo 1 extension, I see it has this Nav Mesh Link component. And the Nav Mesh Link is not the single line off-mesh link like we used previously. It's an entire plane. And any nav mesh that plane touches can connect to another nav mesh. And you can do this in real time, at runtime, whatever. It touches 2 nav meshes, they're linked. So I have this here. I just moved this into my scene. I haven't baked anything or anything else. I hit play. The character's set up to move between one to the next, so they'll move there, run to the other one, drop onto that nav mesh, and now they're dancing on the wall. All right? Because with them linked, with them touching, they are connected, and they can just move from one to the next. Now, along those lines, I want to look at another use case here. I'm going to move into another scene. So I've got this moving platform scene, and I'll press play. And again, this is nothing different, nothing new, nothing spectacular. It's just a player moving around a piece of ground, right? So nothing we haven't seen before. However, I now have the ability to move the ground, all right? I specifically included a gradient background so you didn't think the camera was moving, all right? So that is the ground moving. We can reorient however we want at runtime. It's fine. And so if we want to start running the walls, we want to change the ground to the ceiling. Who here has seen the movie Inception? If we want to do that, well, do that, right? Why not? You will note, however, that the character stops moving when I move the nav mesh. That's important. Just if the character were to keep moving, the character could keep moving as I move the nav mesh. However, every once in a while, I'd need to reorient and flip around because it's on a nav mesh that is constantly moving. You could fix that, but it's really non-performant to do that way. So if you have active nav mesh agents on a moving nav mesh, you can make them update in real time. It's a bit procedurally heavy. It's just better to maybe make them pause, move it, and then have them start back up again. But it is possible if you want to work around it, and you can use this workflow to do all sorts of stuff with the characters. If you want to, again, walking on the walls, running on the ceilings, you want to have like maybe a custom style of 2D game where you use the nav mesh on the side and the camera's oriented a specific way. You can do all sorts of really cool stuff with this reorientation. The common thing, everyone tries to get you, right? Every time I show anyone this, they say, yes, but what about? And they say, what about a globe or a circle, right? Because that, nav meshes tend to be flat. And so everyone's like, I gotcha. What about a globe, like Mario Galaxy? And while that is tricky, absolutely, you can use the nav meshes for something like that, actually. If you treat a globe as if it was, say, maybe a 20-sided object, like a 20-sided die. If you play Dungeons & Dragons, you know what I'm talking about. And you can just have the nav meshes baked to all orientations of the globe like that, so the character can just traverse it. Using that, and then maybe also modifying on the character the nav mesh agent base offset, you can give the character a bunch of smooth motion so they can seem like they're moving in the curve of a circle, right? So you can do all sorts of wacky, weird stuff and make it look pretty cool. But reorienting, now she looks like a shark. Now reorienting the nav meshes allows us to do the things that before we just couldn't do. There was no solution for. So the next thing I want to talk about is probably the most requested feature, all right? And so what that is many of our games procedurally generate their levels or procedurally load their levels. They don't know what the level is going to look like until it loads, right? And we see tons of these games, roguelikes and just all sorts of puzzle games and whatever. We just don't know what the level is going to be. And so before, we haven't been able to do that because the nav meshes had to be baked at edit time in the editor, right? And that is no longer the case. With this new API, with these new high-level components, we can build things at runtime, which is pretty slick. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm just going to press play. And we're going to get a maze. So that's my maze. There it is. Just so you don't think I'm cheating you, I'm going to leave play mode and come back in. It'll generate a different maze. So I'm not cheating here. And what's neat is it's going to generate a maze, and then it will bake a nav mesh on top of it. And now my character can just run around. All right, so pretty slick, and the character can avoid the parts of the maze and navigate around. Now, you might think, okay, fine, that's one example, but what about if I want to do this more? What if I need other ways for this to work? Well, this particular demo is set up in such a way that if I right-click in my game view, it removes the nav mesh. Left-click bakes it again. Remove, bake, remove, bake, remove, bake, as much as I want. Yeah, until I right-click one too many times and accidentally exit the app. So while I'm in play mode, I could, say, click on this piece of ground one, maybe not the one she's on. I'll click over here, and then maybe I'll move that one, and I'll take this one, and I'll move that out of the way, and I'll say, no one likes you, you're in timeout, and get out of here. Okay, so I can do this. I can move these things around. I'm still in play mode. I haven't left play mode here. And if I look in my scene view, I will see that my nav mesh is now wrong, right, because I moved that stuff. But all I have to do, again, left-click in my game view, and there we go, rebuilt it. All right, again, still in play mode, all at runtime. Now, most people will think about this and say, okay, but how much code, what do I have to do? I don't want to write all this code and math and words, I don't want to do any of that stuff. So what is required? And honestly, if you've looked at these, for the people that have used this and you went on to GitHub and you looked at the examples we have and stuff like that, it looks like there's a lot of code. Right? The first time I looked at it, I was like, wow, there's a lot of code to make this work. But when I realized that you actually don't need most of that code, I'll show you what you need. It's actually pretty straightforward. So let me grab my, my Nav Mesh Baker script here, and you're going to see exactly what it takes to bake a Nav Mesh at runtime. I'm going to, in theory, open it up. There we go. It's funny, that's what made my fan kick on. That was the whoa, no, too much. Okay, so if I want to bake a nav mesh, I get a reference to my surface, my nav mesh surface, and I say surface.bake. It can't be much simpler than that. Now, bake is a pretty cool method. I can do a lot of stuff with it. I can gather my own meshes, and I can combine them and build this custom, cool, crazy stuff, and then I can pass it into bake, and it will just bake that thing. Or if I just want to say, you know what, you do it, bake, and it bakes. right? And the neat piece of the low-level API is after I bake, I could get that mesh back and modify it and play with it and screw around with it and then pass it back in and whatever I want to do. But if all I need to do is just bake a nav mesh at runtime, nav mesh surface.bake. If I want to remove it, surface.remove data, right? So really, really simple. 1, 2 lines of code, whatever. I have more code just making sure that I'm clicking the right button than actually baking anything. So it's pretty simple to use as far as that goes. So one other neat thing, and I kind of alluded to this, but I didn't really show it, is, so I've got my world here, again, procedurally built. And if I wanted to, let me just move my character over here. I talked about how a lot of this stuff can be done real time, right? We're all about real time, dynamically. We understand that things change. Your levels change, right? What happens if a player makes a choice that opens up a path that you didn't expect and you need a nav mesh to be there or be available or whatever? Maybe the user gets to define how things are built or put together. What do you do? So I'm going to go back to my prefabs folder. And again, I have that demo 1 extension that I used before. I am in play mode, right? I'm in play mode there. And I'm just going to go ahead and drag that into my scene in play mode. And now I'm just going to click on it, right? Because that Nav Mesh Link touches 2 nav meshes, they're linked, right, in real time. I can even, if I want to, just, this is always kind of fun, move it while she's on there, and she gets the edge and gets like sort of battered around. She doesn't like that. Oh, she's getting off. Okay, fair enough. She decided that wasn't a good ride. Okay, whatever. Yeah, and so, yeah, you can move it around, and they'll stick to it for the most part. It's better if you, like, adhere them to it as opposed to just, whoopsie, they're on that now, or whatever, if you want to be moving it around. And that's sort of what happens if they're moving while an active nav mesh gets moved while they're moving on it. They tend to, like, go, nope, I'm getting out of here. But yeah, really simple. And again, I didn't do anything for that. There was a nav mesh on that prefab. It had a link. They touched. They're linked, right? It's really simple, really straightforward stuff, right? And it just works. I can have as many of these prefabs. I can connect them to each other. I can interconnect them to the stuff that's statically baked, dynamically baked, all that cool stuff. All right, so one more use case I want to talk about, and this isn't one that I hear a lot, but when I hear it with a lot of aggression, so I figured it's probably worth talking about. And so I just have a game object here I'm going to use to do a little alignment. There we go. So I've got this scene, all right, and I have this area baker with a nav mesh surface. I'll bake it. So there we go. So we have this nav mesh, all right? And in my scene, I have this player, and my player's just going to run around, all right? So just moving around. There are no colliders in this scene. I'm using the nav mesh to prevent my player from going places they're not supposed to, right? So no colliders, just nav mesh stuff. Player has an agent on it, and that all works out. Okay, so pretty basic, pretty simple, understandable stuff. Now, while my player is running around, all right, so here's my player, you can see running around there. While my player is running around, the rest of this nav mesh is wasted. So it's wasted memory, it's wasted space, right? If I'm, this scene is fairly small, but that's using our imaginations. We're imagined people, right? Creative types and whatnot. Using our imagination, let's say this was like a 10-kilometer level, a 100-kilometer level, just huge. Well, then how much of that nav mesh being stored in memory is useful to us in any way? Right? Not only that, but potentially rebaking that at runtime could be significantly prohibitive, right? So what do? Why are we wasting all of that space when we really just need the nav mesh here, locally, right? And so this isn't maybe a problem for people doing PC games, but on mobile games or browser games or where memory is a premium asset, right? It can be very problematic. So what do we do about that? And so here is what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at my area baker game object. It's just an empty game object that has this nav mesh surface on it. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this nav mesh surface, because there's more to this. It's deceptively simple. And so obviously we saw that I can choose my agent type. I also have the ability to choose what layers can be built into a nav mesh. So if I want to set up some form of exclusivity, or this surface bakes these layers and this surface bakes these layers, so I can separate them or do cool stuff like that at runtime. But I also have the ability to choose, am I interested in colliders? Maybe I want to bake my nav mesh based on the colliders within my scene, or maybe I'm only interested in the render meshes. Like I said before, there are no colliders in this scene. So if I rebaked with physics colliders checked, I'd have no nav mesh, right? So render meshes is a good one to have. I also can choose what objects I collect, and this is where it gets really powerful. Let's say, instead of a scene-wide bake, which is like traditionally what we've done, right? When I hit bake in the navigation window, that's scene-wide. Instead, what I want to do is I maybe just want to bake this object and children of that object, which is how that prefab is set up. The prefab is set up to say, bake this geometry and any child objects of this geometry, right? And so it's all self-contained. It wouldn't bake anything else if I tried, right? So we can limit it that way. Or we can specify a volume. Just give me this region. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to choose a volume. And I have a volume set up that's 20 units by 10 units by 20. So just a nice rectangle that'll sit around the player. Now, I could go into the advanced stuff. This is all kind of the same as we've seen in the normal nav mesh, so we can determine walkable, not walkable, different areas. That hasn't changed. We haven't lost any features, right? So all the walkables and that and weights. We can choose our voxels. We can override our voxels and tile sizing and all that stuff. I'm going to leave that all as is. I actually believe I did reduce the default tile size to 50 just to kind of make it more obvious what's happening. But I think the default tile size is a little bit bigger. But yeah, I mean, you can adjust and modify all that stuff. It's pretty slick. So now, with this being a volume, if I hit bake, I'll see that it's only going to bake this small region. All right? So how is that useful, right? Because the player could just move away. So here's what I'm going to do. My player has a script that is disabled right now called the agent area baker. And let me just open this up here. And again, real simple. This script just says, hey, has the player moved more than 5 units? Yes, the player has moved more than 5 units. Why do you ask? Well, bake the nav mesh. All right, so what it's going to do is every time the player moves a certain distance, it's going to move that object to it and bake the nav mesh right there. And the player's going to move, it's going to move the object to it and bake the nav mesh right there. And so the player's going to have a bubble of nav mesh around it, following it around, all right, that's going to manage it from colliding, or manage its collisions, prevent it from falling off the world and all that stuff, without using the memory, right, that would be required to store this giant nav mesh. So let's go ahead and see that. So I've turned that on. I'll go ahead and press play, and we'll see that just the area around the agent is baked, and the agent moves, and the volume moves with it, baking just the area around it, and my functionality remains exactly the same. Now, you might be thinking, and it's obvious that the one consideration here is that, okay, baking this nav mesh at runtime isn't that problematic, right? Wouldn't performance be a concern? Yes, I'm saving memory, but I'm also real-time baking a nav mesh. Isn't that super heavy? And the truthful answer is it can be. If you have really, really complex geometry, you're doing this over a very large area at runtime, yeah, sure. There are ways you can break anything, right? But the way this is built is that for anything less than extreme cases, this is highly efficient. This is built in such a way that it's fast, it's asynchronous, right? And only the pieces of the nav mesh that have changed actually get rebaked. So as this player moves, right, one row on each side, one gets added, one gets cut off, those are the only things that are being calculated. The rest of it says, oh, this is just the same nav mesh. Just keep it. Right? And so it's highly efficient in that regard, right? And so we can save ourselves a ton of memory. It's actually fairly performant on the CPU. I encourage all of you to try it out. It's really, really simple to do, and it has a huge impact on memory and calculations and stuff like that at runtime because you're not using these gigantic nav meshes. So a lot of really cool stuff there. Now, I'm going to go ahead and sort of wrap up here. So those are my demos, just talking about, again, just to summarize, right? So the ability to componentize and localize nav meshes, the ability to move and reorient our nav meshes, procedurally bake them, generate them at runtime, and the ability to choose volumes so that we can save ourselves memory and stuff like that. If you want to try these out, Because if you go into Unity 5.6 right now and you go to navigation, you're not going to find that Nav Mesh surface, and you're going to think, where is it? It's set up to be developed in parallel, so it is on GitHub. You can just download it right now with all the samples and all the components and everything, a lot of documentation. All right, so it's just our github.com/Unity Technologies/Nav Mesh Components. All right, highly encourage you to check it out. We do it this way so that we can, parallel develop, so you're not waiting for every release to get all these new features. Just as soon as they're ready on GitHub, there they are, there they are. So feel free to download those, check them out. They're awesome. Definitely worth playing around with. And again, very simple to use and just very plug and play. All right, so that leaves me with a little bit of left time. I'll answer questions if you have them. Otherwise, I'll come to the side. I'll also be over at Ask the Experts for a little bit if you have any questions you want to talk about there. But otherwise, thank you all very much for listening.